Hello, and welcome to Our Special Lives. Today we're talking all about adult transition planning for your special needs child. My guest today is Holly Peele, who is the director of Northstar Career Academy. Holly is an expert in adult transition services. She's been an educator for over 20 years and worked with special needs children for over 15. Northstar Career Academy serves high school students and young adults with special and unique needs to transition into the workplace, and through an affiliated program finds placement in local businesses. Hi, Holly. Welcome to Our Special Lives.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So this is such an important topic and, can be such an overwhelming topic for parents. So let's first start and dig in a little bit. What does transition mean?
That is an excellent question, and it's a huge question, and it's so critical. And I'm very happy that parents are streaming this video and learning more about it, because that is the most important first step. So transition is one term that really encompasses all of the many life changes that happen when your child turns 18 and becomes an adult. So that includes things like, how is their life going to be different when they're potentially no longer living under your roof, or what will that living situation look like? That can include things like transitioning to adult education or training, whatever that might look like, and eventually employment as well. And we encourage people to not think of those as two separate domains, but people go to college to get jobs. So let's keep those in the same category. And it can also talk about things like, how is your social life different? How do you engage in the community in a different way? So it's a very, very broad term that encompasses many of those things. And as we prepare for our children to become adults, there are lots and lots of areas in which parents and families can start to prepare and learn about different ways they can support their child as they move into adulthood.
So, quick question, at what age would you recommend that parents start looking at this sort of roadmap for transition?
That's a great question. I think the first question is, however old your viewer's child is, you're fine. Okay, that's the first thing, is you're not too late. It's okay. Because there's a longer process of first educating yourself as a parent and then taking steps as your child approaches that 18 mark, and then in the first 3 or 4 years after your child passes that 18 mark. Ideally, in a vacuum, it's great for parents to really start educating themselves when their child is 13, 14, 15, around that age. That's also when their child's going to be making a transition from middle school to high school. So as parents are thinking about, what kind of education plan do I want my child to have in high school, that's directly linked to what they think employment outcomes might be, or what maybe would a post-secondary education plan look like for them. So that's a really good time to start thinking about it. And I encourage families to start learning about the different transition domains then, because I think one of the key takeaways I want families to understand is this is a complex topic for everyone. And we find across socioeconomic statuses, across people with different career backgrounds, people who have lived in this country their whole lives versus people who have just joined this country or this community, it can be an overwhelming and complex process. So if parents are feeling overwhelmed and feeling like it's a little bit mystifying how to navigate all of these different services and areas, that's okay. That's the way most people feel. That is normal. And what we advise is spend a year or 2 or 3 participating in webinars like this, or conferences, or other online, exploring other online resources, so that when the 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old range comes into being in your family, you've already become familiar with what some of those transition decision points are, and you can kind of equip yourself with an understanding of what the different processes are for accessing resources and services for your child when they become an adult. And when you have to make a decision, you're not doing it in the context of all this jargon and red tape and organizations with which you haven't had previous contact. So it's a really good idea to, first kind of educate yourself about what all the options are, and then start making decisions. One of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that the transition age, and I'm going to broadly define that very broadly, as like 16 to 24 years old. I don't care whether your child has a disability or not. That's going to be a complex time in their life. They're going to be making a lot of decisions that are very dynamic. And really, we encourage parents to look at this as another developmental stage in their children's lives, especially if their child might have some sort of a developmental delay. In a lot of ways, that child is coming into their own as a young adult, and you're going to see capacity emerge in your child as they exit adolescence and really start young adulthood that you may or may not be able to predict when your child's 15 years old, 14 years old. Sometimes you might not be able to predict it when your child's 17 and 18. What will 21 look like for that child? We see incredibly steep growth curves and maturation curves during that time, which is one of the reasons why I love doing what I do, because it's really fun to watch our young students go through that phase. One of the things that I really encourage parents to think about is that journey of young adulthood, 18 to 30, is a time when people really mature, especially that social emotional learning happens. And you might look at your 16-year-old and wonder, how is the person going to live safely in the community on his or her own? Or how is my son or daughter going to be at a workplace and make wise decisions about not getting in the car with someone, or having stamina, or not engaging in a behavior that is ultimately harmless, but might be off-putting to a colleague, or you might be concerned that there are some colleagues that might find it off-putting. How is that going to work? I would just encourage parents to remember that maturation is a magical and wonderful thing, and that it does happen, and that sometimes it goes a little bit longer, but that it comes, and it's a beautiful thing to watch your child's spirit emerge in that way. So one of the things I want to remind parents is that maturation is a wonderful process. And for many students, depending on the disability, it may take some extra years in order to get there. If you look at brain research, you can see that for a neurotypical person, whatever that means, the brain continues to develop until age 25. And for a couple of specific disabilities, some neuroscience has pinpointed that brain development lasting until age 30. So specifically for folks who might be on the autism spectrum, or people with ADHD, that frontal lobe continues to come in until age 30. And of course, the frontal lobe is where all of that executive function happens. And that's where all that adult decision-making happens. So it will come. Sometimes it comes on a child's own time, on a person's own time, but it will definitely help with the decision-making processes that come with transition.
Obviously, you acknowledge that parents can find this kind of a really overwhelming topic. And you talked about the fact that children are kind of rapidly developing. So how does this rapid development play into like some of the decisions that you might make?
That's a really important question. And I think what I see some of our parents expressing is it's very hard to make some of these decisions. So let's take one major domain of transition, which is not a discrete domain. It touches all the rest of them. And that has to do with legal decision making. So let's say I have my child, little Holly, is 17 years old, and Holly's not making great decisions about concerning social boundaries. And maybe little Holly still has some behaviors that in the workplace might prove a little bit challenging if I'm customer facing. And Holly's mom and dad are wondering, when she turns 18, should we take the step of trying to retain guardianship so that we can continue to support her and protect her, even though she's turned 18? And this is a really hard decision. So I just want to give some food for thought. First of all, happily, there is a progressive trend happening right now in court cases involving guardianship, where if you do retain guardianship, no longer does that mean it's incredibly difficult to decide that your child no longer needs guardianship. That wasn't always the case. And of course, this hasn't been consistent across the country in the same places, but I can say in Virginia, more and more often, judges might decide that guardianship can be retained for 2 years to 5 years, and then have that person's case come in their court again and review how has that person matured and grown, and are they now ready to be their own guardian? So that's a wonderful thing. And my hat's off to all the advocates who have been out there in the community working for that. Because sometimes people just need a little bit of extra time before they're ready to take on those decisions. But the other thing I would really encourage parents to look into, And you can get some good resources by Googling. We'll also try to drop a link in the comments, is supported decision making. So one of the ways that we really encourage our students to think about decision making is to understand just because you're an adult, that does not mean you have to make all your decisions by yourself. In fact, the thing that adults do that's different from children is that they get to choose the people who will advise them in decision making. If I am filing my taxes and something's complicated, I don't have to do that all by myself just because I'm an adult. I might seek a professional consultant, and I might seek somebody who's not a professional consultant, but who's within my circle of support, like my uncle, who's really good at filing taxes. He's not a finance person, but he knows a lot of those ins and outs. And I might call him up and say, hey, can you help me with this question? I also refer to the classic example for anybody who likes watching HGTV and those house hunting shows. Mm-hmm. People always bring along a friend to help them make a decision like that. There's nothing that's specific to disability that says that we need people in our lives to support us when we're making these really big decisions. And what we find is the more we support young people in making decisions, supporting them in the unique way they need to be supported, the less we can curtail their legal rights. Guardianship is always a very difficult decision, and I am not in a position to make that decision for any other family. I think, it would be difficult for me to make that decision myself. Every family is going to have to make that for themselves. But what's important to know is that you don't necessarily have to go full guardianship if you're concerned that your child really needs some legal supports. There are options such as developing a power of attorney, and you can have a power of attorney developed for medical purposes, which is more often referred to as an advance directive. But you can also have a power of attorney for educational services. And you can also work with your child creatively on finances. So, for example, let's say your child as an adult is going to receive SSI. There can be another person who is the payee of that SSI check who's going to help the recipient manage those finances, even if that person is his or her own guardian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful because I know both of those topics are a huge concern to parents at this stage. So basically, you're saying that there are lots of options, and you're saying that you need to kind of educate yourself on what the options are and then take that second step of deciding which options are appropriate for your child.
Exactly. And that's what we really try to encourage our parents to do. Is step one is to load up your toolkit. You don't need to predetermine if your child, when your child is 20 years old, is going to need someone to go to the doctor with him or her, right? You don't have to decide that in advance. But what you can do in advance is go ahead and find an attorney with whom you are very comfortable working and have that initial conversation about what are the legal options, what are the specific documents our family would have to draw up in order to make this happen. What is the legal timeline in order to bring these things into effect? Because sometimes you have to wait till after the person is 18. Sometimes some documentation, maybe some medical documentation about a disability needs to be gathered before the person turns 18. Sometimes that 18th birthday is not so important. I'm sure many of us have experience caring for older relatives who have a power of attorney or a medical directive put into place much later in life. Mm-hmm. So that timeline can vary depending on which legal tool you're examining.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds great. And it sounds like you can just decide at the time. You've got a lot of options, and some you may use and some you may not use. And so it's just a question of kind of picking through what's available to you and what's most appropriate.
Exactly. One of the things that changes when a person transitions from being a school-age child to being an adult, and this changes when the child exits K-12 education, okay, is that child is no longer protected by IDEA, which is the law that governs special education. And now that child's going to be protected by a series of other laws, the primary one being the Americans with Disabilities Act. Also, the Rehabilitation Act is an important one. Under that law, in order to access those protections, what's really important is that you have a written diagnosis of whatever the disability is. And I would strongly encourage families to get that written diagnosis within 12 to 24 months before the 18th birthday. Having that primary source document that is relevant and time bound, right at the time the child becomes an adult, is a very, very useful tool. And keep that thing on hand because you're going to need it to access rights in a number of different settings. So, for example, let's say you are going to, your child's going to go to college, and your child just needs to access accommodations in college. There's not going to be an IEP in college. What they're going to do is go to the student services office, and they'll need to present that documentation in order to access accommodations at the college level. That's also true at work. Let's say the young adult gets a job, but there's going to need to be a couple of accommodations in place in order to make work successful. That is the same documentation that is required to be presented to the HR office, if in fact the HR office requires it. That varies across workplaces. That's the same documentation that simply says, I am entitled to protections under ADA. So having that on hand is incredibly helpful.
So it sounds like there are multiple decision points and that there are multiple options and solutions at each of those decision points. So can you tell us a little bit about how to navigate that?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm going to start with what's probably one of the simplest of examples, and then we can talk about some that are a little bit more complex. So a straightforward example would be, how are you going to handle transportation? Okay, so a lot of our students who come to Northstar Career Academy, they may not necessarily get their driver's license right when they turn 16. First of all, this is more and more common these days. But second of all, maybe they are on track to get their license, but they're not quite there yet. Sometimes parents are concerned about exploring other transportation options because, that could be perceived as negative either by them or by their child. Them sharing with their child, you're not going to get a license, which is, a point that could trigger some grief, because that's letting go of a pretty important developmental milestone. But what I would encourage parents to consider is that even if a person does get a driver's license, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to always be in a position to drive or be in a position to drive all places or under all conditions. So there are other options out there that can provide that young person with that awesome feeling of independence and confidence that comes from getting the driver's license. So I think we've all seen a 16 or 17 or 18-year-old who's just gotten their license and has their car keys in their hand, and they're constantly playing with them and jingling them because it's just an amazing time to have that level of independence. And what we've seen is that some of our students who pursue these other options also get that feeling of confidence and independence, which of course is a very positive upward spiral. If they know that they can achieve that, there's all these other things they can achieve as well. So as you're looking into transportation options, there are a lot of supported transportation options available. They're different county to county and state to state. If you're in the greater Richmond area, even just within this area in Central Virginia, there are quite a few different ones that you can explore. Everything from Hanover Dash to the Caravan. And these are private companies that go in and out of business. So I would advise that you work very closely with your special education case manager or your DARS case manager to learn which companies are the most relevant for you. When the person applies and is determined eligible using that key document that you've gathered, demonstrating that they're eligible for protections under ADA, they can learn how to use supported transportation. That is a skill set in and of itself. You have to call, you have to schedule the ride, you have to wait outside in public and identify which vehicle you're supposed to get in. You're supposed to verify with the driver, is it safe to get in or not get in? The first couple of times you ride, you might want to ride with a parent or sibling or some other person who's going to help that process be comfortable. And then when it's time to get picked up, you have to stand outside and do the whole thing again. Having mastered that process, even if this person is not going to, over the course of their lifetime, always use supported transportation, that in and of itself can be a confidence builder. The other thing that a number of our students learn to do is how to use Uber or Lyft in a very safe way. We've got a task analysis we created with all the steps you have to go through to make sure that when you call an Uber driver or a Lyft driver, you're getting in the right car and that is a safe thing to do. And our parents do things like preload addresses in their children's phones and turn on trackers. So they know that when their child is taking an Uber, they can track exactly where that child is using their phone. And sometimes they'll practice. We have one parent who lives about 2 miles from the grandparents' house, and they will just Uber, 2 miles from their house to the grandparents' house. And sometimes people will follow them in their car because it's nerve-wracking, right? To put your child in somebody else's car, especially an anonymous service like Uber or Lyft, and we'll follow them. But then once they get the system down, just like we do in every other area of our children's lives, we can slowly step back and fade and provide more and more independence. And it can be very, very confidence boosting for our folks who are coming through. And finally, I would like to put one resource on people's radars, and that is travel training. I can speak specifically to Central Richmond. We have an amazing resource in GRTC, the bus system. They provide free travel training to anyone who is eligible for supported transportation. So, of course, first you have to show that you're eligible with that very important eligibility document. But then there is a transportation specialist who will come to your home and meet you and meet your young adult or adult child and discuss, what would be an appropriate plan for this person to learn how to ride the bus. And a lot of our students really, really benefit from this, even if they live in rural areas, because here's what can happen. Let's say this is a young person who's going to get a driver's license, but maybe this young person has a recurrent health issue, or maybe struggles with anxiety. There are going to be days where that person is not comfortable driving because there was a wreck on the interstate, or because they had a seizure the night before, or because they're having a joint flare up. Whatever it is, they are not in a physical space to really focus and be a calm driver that day. Well, what they can do then is maybe a family member can drive them and drop them off at a public library or a safe public space. And from that space, they can ride the bus where they need to go when they need to get there. A lot of our young people, when they enter employment, they may not immediately go to a traditional 40-hour-a-week schedule. And so if mom and dad have a 40-hour-a-week schedule, they need something to be happening with that young adult while the young adult is waiting to go to work. So having a hybrid plan like that can really be useful. Also,
that's really cool.
Yeah, that person is getting support every step of the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Can you tell us a little bit, because I think it's important no matter where you live in the country to know that there are these resources out there, but can you tell us a little bit about the Northstar Career Academy and then, kind of the more workplace services in general, so that if somebody's listening to this and they maybe live in North Carolina or something like that, they can kind of seek out maybe something similar that might be available in their community?
Absolutely. So just specifically about Northstar, and Northstar Academy has been around for about 26 years. Northstar Career Academy is our career and technical ed arm of that. And we provide career preparation training for young adults who are getting ready to enter the workforce. And this is another domain of transition. A lot of folks will be wonderful assets to a business somewhere when they join the workforce, but they may need to enter the workforce a little bit more creatively than just, filling out an application online. Sometimes that can include things like a job coach, where they work one-on-one with someone who's technically called an employment specialist, but conversationally often called a job coach, where that person is going to help them seek out pre-existing jobs that might be out there with which they'll be a good fit. Or maybe that person is going to be in contact with businesses and carve out a position for them that will really meet both the business's needs and will give this person an opportunity to engage in employment. And this is a great example of a decision point that can be tough for parents when your child is 15 or 16 years old. You might not be sure if your child's going to be able to just, apply for a job at Kroger and become a bagger as that first employment experience, or if that person might need support. And so what I would encourage parents to do is go ahead and apply for eligibility for whatever your state's vocational rehabilitation services are. In Virginia, it's called DARS, the Department of Aging and Rehabilitation Services.
Okay.
And your school should be able to help with that process. That just because you're determined eligible doesn't mean you have to then work with an employment specialist. You can decide that later. And you can decide the degree to which you're going to get supports in that process. And as the person matures and grows, their needs might change. They might not need as much support in that first employment experience, but then when they exit and want to do a more challenging job, they might need more on-the-job training and support.
Yeah. I have a question for you, and I don't know if it's able to be put in a list, but do you have like a top five in terms of looking at transition? And I know it's like a big period of time, but like what are maybe the top five transition issues? We talked about guardianship. We talked about driver's license and transportation. We talked about employment training and potentially employment placement. What are kind of another few of the big decisions that parents have to make during that transition period?
Excellent question. Those three you named are three really big ones. Another one is independent living. So, how and where is your young adult going to live long term? A lot of these services are wrapped up in things called Medicaid waivers.
Mm-hmm.
And the Medicaid waiver application process can be long and complex depending on what waiver you're applying for and what community you live in. And I would encourage you to research these as soon as possible, looking into those options because they do vary dramatically. We serve 20 localities in Central Virginia, and they vary dramatically from locality to locality in terms of wait time. And so accessing some supports for independent living can be dependent on what kind of waiver your child may or may not receive. So I would say start that as soon as possible, learn about what that process is, and also seek out support from other families in your specific locality to learn kind of the inside track on how that process goes. There's a lot of Facebook groups online that I know that our families join, and they're able to learn exactly, kind of tricks of the process to access the services and supports that their child needs. So independent living, for example, can be a challenging situation. Maybe at first your child's going to live with you, but then you want to seek out, are there programs in your area where they might be able to live with a friend, but have someone drop in and check on them? Are there supported living facilities where they can live primarily as an adult, but have someone on hand in case there's some sort of crisis?
Is that a group home?
Yeah.
Is that what people refer to as a group home?
Sometimes it's a group home, but sometimes it's a freestanding apartment that has someone on call. Sometimes it could be a private apartment, but they have a support person who they can call. Sometimes just a phone call, having somebody at the other end of the phone can help them problem solve. And a lot of times this winds up being the parent appropriately. A lot of times we all rely on our parents being on the other end of the call. But one of the things to keep in mind is that parents have their own needs too. We work with a lot of families who are dealing with real challenges as parents. So, for example, over the course of the past 20, 25 years, I can't even count the number of parents who have developed a serious health condition while their children are this age. And I hate to bring that up because it's can feel a little alarmist, but we all have to be aware of our own mortality. And if you're experiencing a health issue, it can be very difficult for you then to be on the spot for your adult child all the time. COVID brought this home. We had a couple of families where that really impacted them, and their young adult was at home and had to be supported, and mom and dad were down for the count for a little bit. So getting those services lined up can be months or even years. So having them lined up, having all of those eligibility processes in place, having those cases open is a really important groundwork to lay. I always say, think of it as insurance. Do you have a will? Do you have insurance? I have car insurance. I hope I don't get in a wreck today, right? I'm not going to predetermine that I'm necessarily going to need that insurance, but absolutely I'm going to have a will and I'm going to have insurance. I hope I never need it. Think about having these cases open with social services, with your community services board, with the Department of Aging and Rehab Services as insurance. And then as you're moving through life, as need presents itself, you can call up those agencies and say, okay, we need an employment plan, or we need to access some of those waiver services because I'm going to be in chemo for the next month and I need somebody to be able to support my young adult child.
Yeah, I will say that we talked at the beginning of our conversation about how you don't want to make too many decisions ahead of time. But from my personal experience, getting on that waiver wait list should happen like immediately if you're not already on it and you think there's any chance at all that you might need it. Because just as an example, my son's been on the waiver waiting list since he was 3. He's 11 now. and he's actually been on the urgent waiting list for that waiver, and he still has not gotten it. So that just kind of gives you some idea about how long these waiting lists are or can be. And so it's very important to kind of chase down that piece as soon as you can if you think that a Medicaid waiver program is going to be something that your child would use.
And I would also strongly encourage parents, and maybe you can speak to this as well, in seeking that support from other parents. Because sometimes going through that process and maintaining eligibility can be incredibly taxing. So don't underestimate how much stress that can cause you as a parent, and how much special needs parents, they carry a heavy load anyway. Yeah. And it can be incredibly helpful to be networking with other parents and finding out, let's say you weren't declared eligible for a certain service. Well, what should I do? Does that mean that I'm not a good fit for this? Or does that mean, oh no, that happens all the time, and so that I should appeal this? And what evidence should I bring? And how should I manage all of this, what sometimes feels like red tape? Yeah. So that you can definitely be an advocate for your child, and make sure that you're meeting your own emotional needs during that process as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. So let's talk about just some key takeaways for parents to think about. As we've kind of talked, in broad brush about this very large topic, what are some of your key takeaways, do you think?
I think the key takeaway would be to educate yourself first and make decisions second. The second thing I would say is, as you identify areas where you might need to go through a rather lengthy process, like a waiver application, an SSI application, an eligibility for DARS application, eligibility for supported transportation application, budget a time over a year to 18 months where you're going to systematically just attack those processes and communicate transparently with your child about how you're doing this to equip them with options. You're trying to open as many doors as possible for them, and together you will decide which doors you want to walk through as a second step, right? Don't wait to decide what you need first and then try to get the things in place, because then you're in a time of need, right? Yeah. And these things don't happen quickly. Mm-hmm. So that's a key takeaway. The second thing is, I would recommend checking out the Critical Decisions Points resource that's available from imdetermined.org. It's an amazing organization. And you can also check out that. Yes. And check out northstaracademy.net. We have periodic family education nights. We usually have 4 to 6 a year where we cover these topics. So that would be a key thing. And then the final takeaway would be to understand that most people feel overwhelmed and frustrated at points during this process, and that's okay. So know yourself and know the supports that you're going to need to navigate those feelings at the same time you're navigating all of these high stakes decisions.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. Holly, I can't thank you enough for coming on today. And I just really appreciate all your wisdom and advice. And I think this is going to be really helpful for parents trying to navigate this transition period.
Well, thank you so much for all that you do. I'm so glad that you're getting the word out.
Oh, great.
Good stuff.
Well, thank you.